In central Wyoming, where winds can blow across endless plains for weeks and sullen mountains lie gray on the horizon, Ethan Miller's hunting ranch was located. Tourists rarely traveled along these roads. They preferred more civilized and popular destinations. Local residents were accustomed to space and silence and did not complain about the lack of large cities nearby. It was this solitude and silence that once became the reasons why Ethan chose this land to start a new life after the army. Ethan went through a lot as a military man. Years of service left their mark, in his bearing, in the habit of behaving with restraint and precision, in the special look with which he studied the area around him. It would seem that, compared to the stress and dangers in the hot spots, the boredom and peaceful existence on the ranch might seem like paradise to him. This was partly true. He bought this land about 5 years ago, investing the money he had saved and the benefits he received. Built or restored buildings and barns, equipped them with everything necessary for the economy. At first, the local wilderness remained a wilderness. Lack of shops, rare contacts with people, the obligatory need to go to the city for any serious purchases. But over time, Ethan liked it. He appreciated the measured rhythm, the silence in the mornings, and the exciting solitude with nature. On the territory of the ranch stood a spacious wooden house, his house. Built in the traditional style of the area, with a wide porch and massive beams, it gave the impression of a strong fortress, especially compared to what modern contractors often build. Around the house, poplars and aspens rustled, their leaves flickering with silver reflections in the wind. Ethan personally planted them as seedlings when he was just settling in, wanting his property to be not only functional, but also beautiful. Inside, the house was equipped with everything necessary for a comfortable life. A kitchen, a living room with a fireplace, a bedroom, and several guest rooms. Ethan usually invited his guests to dig in a small guest house, which was located about 20 meters from the main building. The building was made in a more modern style, but with the same wooden trim and pitched roof. Ethan kept spare sleeping bags, blankets, old furniture there in general, everything so that a person would not have to huddle on the floor if he decided to spend the night. The ranch was filled with horses and a few deer, which Ethan kept more out of love for the animals than for profit. Nearby, there was a small pond fed by spring water from the mountains. In summer, the water in it warmed up, and you could swim, but in winter, the reservoir was completely frozen in ice. A dense forest belt began a little further away, then turning into wild, almost untouched land. Here Ethan organized a hunt for himself and his few acquaintances who shared his hobby. One of the features of this place were dogs, Ethan's faithful comrades and assistants. He kept several dogs of different breeds, from large, strong guard dogs such as Malamutes and German Shepherds to agile and intelligent hunting breeds, border collies, foxhounds. Each dog had its own name and character traits, and Ethan treated them with special warmth. He recalled that in the Army, the ability to get along with service dogs meant no less than possession of a weapon. These intelligent creatures often saved lives. Ethan's calm, somewhat harsh outwardly life took on new colors when Lily. They met a little over 2 years ago in a small town, where Lily, being a bright and cheerful girl, worked in a cafe. Her long reddish hair and her smile, which seemed radiant to him, immediately captivated Ethan's heart. For a long time he did not dare to approach, embarrassed by his soldier's character, but one day, finding himself unusually brave, he nevertheless invited her on a date. To his surprise, Lily agreed without much hesitation. A year later, they got married. For Lily, accustomed to the city and constant communication, moving to the ranch was a drastic change in lifestyle. However, for a while she seemed to find a special romance in it. Fresh air, starry nights, the beauty of sunrises and sunsets over the Wyoming mountains. She gladly helped Ethan with housework. She learned to cook on the grill, mastered horse riding, and went with him on walks deep into the forest. Ethan believed that everything was going perfectly. He had a beloved wife, faithful dogs, a reliable roof over his head, and a business that brought inner satisfaction. Besides Lily, Ethan was a frequent guest at the house. Dan, friend and former colleague. They met in the Army. Dan served there, but left a little earlier. Unlike the reserved Ethan, Dan was a bright and sociable person, easily winning over people. He tried himself in various businesses and eventually became involved in supplying hunting equipment. His connections and ability to bargain helped him make good money. Dan came to the ranch under the pretext of taking a break from the city and hunting, as well as bringing various gifts or interesting new items to Ethan and Lily. He usually had the last word in the field of weapons and equipment with him. He loved to show off a cool rifle or some rare hunting knife. Lily, seeing his easy disposition and ability to entertain others with stories, treated him friendly, sometimes even with delight. Dan knew how to joke, laugh, and easily chatted with her about various trifles. At the same time, he could talk with Ethan about service and difficult everyday life in the army. It would seem like an ideal friendship for three. So far, this has been the case. As the years passed, Ethan felt that his life was finally making sense. He had the woman he loved next to him, he had a quiet business, he had a good friend. He, accustomed to discipline and clarity, was sometimes amazed at how harmoniously everything worked out. After all, in the army he saw grief, faced death, and now, it seemed, everything was arranged for peace. However, happiness, the way he pictured it for himself, turned out to be fragile. Along the invisible cracks hiding under the external idol, the first microcracks were already creeping, which would soon turn into an abyss of disappointment and betrayal. As autumn arrived and the golden-red foliage bloomed around the ranch, Ethan noticed a change in Lily. At first, they were elusive. She began to scroll through her phone more often and did not leave it on the table, as she had done before, when she could carefreely put her mobile phone anywhere and forget it for half a day. Now she carried it with her even at home, and when she received a message, she pretended that they were writing something very personal to her. Ethan was not a jealous person by nature. He believed that trust was the basis of any relationship. But changes in his wife's behavior worried him. Cool evenings were approaching. Lily loved to have cozy gatherings by the fireplace, but she began to be distracted by calls every now and then. Sometimes she would say, "I'll be right back, my friend is calling me," and would go off the porch, trying to speak in a muffled voice. Then she returned with a mysterious look, as if she was afraid that Ethan would ask about her interlocutor. But he was silent. He didn't think it was right to put pressure. Every day Lily became more distant. She looked sadly out the window and often said that she was bored at the ranch, that she wanted something new, although until recently she had enjoyed every little detail of rural life. Ethan didn't understand what happened. Yes, there are times when a person gets tired and lacks entertainment, but sometimes she literally flinched when he suddenly entered the room, as if she had been taken by surprise. In addition to this, Dan's visits became more frequent. Previously, he appeared once a month to bring new hunting gear to spend a weekend in nature. Now he could drop by during the week, late in the evening, under the pretext, "I was passing through and decided to drop by." He did not always stay overnight, but if he did, he behaved very freely. Lily greeted him cordially, laughed at every joke, and willingly accepted any gifts from him. Ethan noticed that sometimes strange glances appeared between Lily and Dan, short, filled with some kind of emotion that he could not figure out. It could have been his own fantasies, but doubt was beginning to eat away at his soul. He was especially alarmed by the moment when Dan once called Lily Sunshine and habitually put his hand on her shoulder. Previously, Ethan would have chalked it up to a friendly joke or Dan's increased sociability, but now the gesture seemed too familiar to him. Lily just smiled, without moving away. Ethan felt uneasy, although he didn't show it. He began to pay closer attention to details, how Dan and Lily communicate, what words and intonations they use with each other. Sometimes these two exchanged short phrases and chuckles, as if they had their own little secret. All this could have a completely harmless explanation, just a general sense of humor or friendly banter. But Ethan's intuition, which he had come to rely on in the army, told him there was something more here. Intimate life with Lily also became different. She began to refuse intimacy more often, citing fatigue or a bad mood. Ethan tried to talk to her, offered to take her to the city for the weekend, give her a new thing, but she still seemed to withdraw from communication. At the same time, he noticed that she reacted to Dan more animatedly than to her own husband. This, in turn, made Ethan feel depressed. "Lily," he asked one day, unable to stand it, "are you sure everything is fine with you? Maybe there's something you'd like to talk about?" She looked away. "Just the autumn blues, Ethan. Don't worry, everything will be fine." He did not insist, but the doubt only strengthened. This was the period when the situation did not seem catastrophic to him. After all, this happens in marriage, temporary difficulties, changes in mood. But something inside, like a sensitive scanner, continued to detect danger. Late one evening, with a gusty wind raging outside the windows, Ethan sat in the living room, half asleep, watching a TV show about hunting. Lily should have been back an hour ago. She only promised to quickly go grocery shopping. Finally, she called and said that she had met a friend and they were chatting over coffee in a cafe in the city. Ethan wanted to be glad that his wife was having fun, but the dull feeling inside wouldn't let go. Besides, he knew that the cafe Lily was talking about closed earlier than she usually arrived. One might think that she went somewhere else, but then why doesn't she tell the truth? At first he tried to calm himself down. You never know, maybe they moved to another place, or did something important happen to your friend? When Lily returned, it was already dark. She entered the house looking somewhat embarrassed. Ethan asked if everything was okay. She nodded, avoiding continuing the topic. He could smell someone else's perfume on her clothes, or maybe it was a light perfume from the mall where she might have gone shopping. Either way, something was wrong. Lily just said, "Sorry, I was just chatting with a friend." Ethan was silent. The anxiety in his heart grew. Half an hour later, Lily went to the shower, and Ethan noticed. Her phone was lying on the table in the living room. She never now, "I didn't leave him unattended, but then I forgot," or was it an accident? He approached the device and wanted to pick it up, but stopped. "I don't want to be a spy," he thought, "but I need to know if she's deceiving me." In the end, he didn't touch the phone. Self-respect and military honor did not allow him to steal information from his wife's personal device. However, deep down he was burning with the desire to find out everything. Soon, another episode occurred that lit a red light in Ethan's mind. One day, he walked into the kitchen just as Lily was talking to someone on the phone in an unusually affectionate tone. Hearing her husband's steps, she instantly changed her voice and quickly, almost hastily, said goodbye. After that, she became noticeably nervous and silently finished washing the dishes. To the direct question, "Who was it?" she answered something incomprehensible about a friend from another state. On the same day, Ethan, during Dan's next visit, involuntarily caught a snippet of their conversation. Lily reminded Dan of something, but when she saw her husband, she interrupted the sentence mid-sentence. And Dan, noticing Ethan, smiled broadly, as if there was nothing suspicious about it. From that very moment, Ethan became more attentive to any hints or indirect evidence. And the more he looked, the more often he caught Lily's confused or guilty glances. That fall, Ethan had a lot to do at the ranch. He had to winterize the house, check the stock of animal feed, mend the fence, but he could hardly find a place for himself, constantly thinking about the changed relationship with his wife. Many acquaintances said that autumn can exacerbate tension between people, especially in secluded places. But Ethan knew it wasn't just the season. His experience in intelligence operations suggested that if your ally begins to avoid direct communication, hide evidence, and change habits, then trouble is approaching. This year's hunting season promised to be busy. There were quite a lot of migrating ducks, and deer were still running in abundance across the distant lands. Dan was planning to come again and spend a few days at the ranch. Lily tensed up when she learned about this, but then showed genuine joy and even offered to cook a special lunch for Dan. Ethan, noticing her animation, felt a jealous anxiety awakening in the depths of his soul, which was becoming increasingly difficult to control. The day before Dan's arrival, Lily behaved especially restlessly. She looked out the window, talked a lot on the phone, and almost always went outside when she started a conversation. Ethan caught only fragments of phrases, indistinct, "Yeah, yes, yes, we'll do that. Okay, I'm waiting." His own nerves were strained, and he decided to speak out. That evening, he told his wife that he was concerned about her behavior, but Lily replied that nothing extraordinary was happening and suggested they just wait for Dan to arrive. That very evening, Ethan was about to go to bed, but suddenly remembered that he had not fed the dogs. One of the dogs in the far enclosure was whining sadly. He put on his jacket and walked out into the darkness. The light, frosty air was invigorating. The lantern highlighted his steps in the grass. When he approached the pens, he accidentally turned to the side guest house. Surprisingly, the light was on inside. But no one lives there yet. Dan will arrive only tomorrow. Ethan became wary. Who could be in the house? Perhaps Lily decided to clean it up before the guest arrived. But why now, late evening? His heart sank when he noticed flickering shadows on the closed curtain. Two shadows. Trying not to make noise, Ethan approached the house from the side where the windows looked out onto the vacant lot. He clearly saw on the curtains the outlines of two figures merging in too close, frank contact. The shadows moved, and their position clearly indicated what was happening between people in the intimate scene. Ethan felt something break inside him. No, he wanted to tell himself, it can't be Lily, perhaps one of the workers. But there were no workers, they had already left. My heart was beating so hard that it seemed ready to burst out of my chest. He tried to find at least some other explanation, but there was none. Having gathered his resolve, he slowly and silently opened the door, holding a lantern in his hands. The room was lit by a dim lamp enough to see Lily and Dana in the most intimate moment. Their skin, sweaty from the hot intimacy, reflected the yellow light of the lamp. They were so carried away by each other that they did not notice how the door opened. Ethan froze on the threshold, unable to look away. The brain seemed to refuse to believe what it saw. But this was not a hallucination, not a play of shadows. A wife and best friend, consumed by passion. The next seconds stretched into eternity for Ethan. He felt a sickening wave of rage and despair rise up in his throat. If he had acted on impulse, he might have rushed at Dan, pulled him off Lily, and made a fuss. But the army training maintaining self-control in critical situations worked automatically. Cold determination flowed through his veins like ice. Ethan not created a scandal. He slowly, almost silently, closed the door, returning it to its previous position. From the inside, it seems they didn't notice his short presence. Lily and Dan were too absorbed in each other. Ethan walked away from the house, clenching his fists so that his nails dug into his palms. The pain in his arms was nothing compared to the mental pain that completely overwhelmed him. The wind ruffled his hair and his heart beat wildly. Thousands of thoughts came to mind. How could they? How long does it last? What to do next? Kill, scream, call the police, or just leave? But in the end, he only breathed heavily, standing in the darkness of the night, listening to the rustle of autumn leaves under his feet. The howl of the wind merged for him with the roar in his ears. Squatting next to the dog's enclosure, Ethan stared into space for several minutes. Not a single dog was visible nearby. They were either sleeping or, sensing their owner's rage, hid. A battle was going on in his head. On one side, the rage of betrayal raged. On the other, a strange, cold calm, characteristic of Ethan in extreme situations. He knew that blind rage would not bring a solution, but would only expose him to the law and destroy everything completely. Ethan returned to the house, trying not to make any noise. Lily didn't show up in the bedroom until late at night. Apparently, she and Dan continued to indulge in their passion, not having the slightest idea that they had been caught in the act of a crime. Ethan lay down on the bed, looking at the ceiling, but his eyes did not close. During the time he spent in the army, he saw a lot of death and betrayal, but he never thought that this would happen in his own family. In the morning, he woke up early, although he slept only a couple of hours. Lily still had not returned to the bedroom, but he heard her quiet steps somewhere in the corridor. She entered the house from the street, awkwardly brushing off her clothes. Seeing Ethan, she smiled dryly, as if she was embarrassed, but she tried to pretend that everything was normal. Apparently, she came up with some kind of excuse for herself, or thought that her husband did not notice her absence in bed. "How did you sleep?" she asked casually. Fine, Ethan replied evenly. Are you all right? Yes. I couldn't sleep a little. I went out to get some air. Lily shrugged. He nodded, feeling that his own calm was just a thin veneer over his raging hatred. But now he didn't want to burn bridges. After what he had seen last night, he understood that he could not live in the old way. However, he does not intend to make a scandal openly. Revenge, this word, born in his head, took on a threatening meaning. Never in his life had he felt such cold determination to settle a score, and not in a fit of emotion, but quietly, measuredly, thoughtfully. In the afternoon, Dan, as if nothing had happened, came out of the guest house, saw Ethan by the pens, and happily waved his hand. Hello, buddy. I thought you were still sleeping. Ready to hunt? Ethan just nodded, suppressing the anger rushing out. Outwardly, it looked as if they were still good friends. Lily, seeing Dan, looked away, but then turned on her usual friendly smile on her face. Ethan bit his lip, realizing that in order to carry out his own plan, he would have to maintain the appearance of a normal relationship at least for a while. That same day, Dan suggested choosing a place to shoot ducks, and then heading deep into the woods to look for deer. Ethan reluctantly agreed, but said that he himself could not go with him now, household matters. Dan waved him off, saying, okay, when there's time, we'll go hunting together. In the evening, he was going to leave for the city, and in a week he would return again, as usual. Ethan chuckled in his heart. Yes, dear friend, you will come back, but I already know how this will come back to haunt you. With each passing hour, he realized more and more clearly that he would not let Lily and Dan get away with it so easily. Lily's ignorance hurt him even more. Her calm behavior only emphasized the depth of the betrayal. She felt completely safe, which meant that she did not feel a shadow of remorse or shame. Ethan, looking at her, thought, what a person. Is she even capable of worrying? Or has passion turned off her conscience so much? Ethan answered her in short remarks, trying not to reveal his feelings. Occasionally, she cast interested glances at him, as if she noticed that something had changed in him, but did not understand what exactly. He continued to behave evenly, without being excessively rude or, on the contrary, excessively affectionate. He knew that too strong an emotional reaction could give away his thoughts. If I were a hot-tempered husband, he thought, I would have already caused a scandal, driven her away, or killed her. But I want something else. I want her to suffer when everything is revealed. And this will not happen by chance, and not today, but when I decide. That same day, Lily busied herself around the house, sometimes starting to clean, although she was not usually a fan of scrubbing the floors from morning to evening. Probably her joy from merging with Dan gave her strength, and her conscience, which perhaps lay dormant deep inside, made her look like an exemplary wife in front of her husband. Several times Lily tried to start a conversation on unrelated topics, about the weather, about dogs. But Ethan either nodded silently or responded with monosyllabic answers. He was seething internally with resentment, but tried to maintain the illusion that he was simply in a bad mood. In the afternoon, Dan came into the house and was about to leave for his place. He also seemed to be in high spirits, although he was probably trying to hide it. His smile faded slightly at the sight of Ethan. Lily came out to his porch, where they exchanged a few words. All this happened right under the gaze of Ethan, who stood a little to the side. A swarm of thoughts buzzed inside him. Now they are having a conversation, thinking that I am blind and an idiot. But it won't last long. Dan was full of gratitude. Thank you for your hospitality, as always. Your house is amazing, Ethan, and thank you for everything you do for me. Ethan listened to this hypocrisy and thought that Dan was probably bragging to himself. How cleverly he pulled it off, and no one understood anything. But all he said out loud was, always happy to help, Dan. Come again when you have time. You know, we have a lot of animals here in distant lands. Next time, if you want a real hunt, I can show you untouched trails. Dan, of course, was fired up. He was always eager for everything unusual. Oh yes, of course, I'll be glad. We can organize a whole adventure, spend the night in the forest, track down deer, or even wolves if you're lucky," he responded with enthusiasm. Ethan clenched his fists so hard that his nails dug into his palms. Dan's smug look seemed like a mockery to him. But Ethan's reserved face did not betray a drop of anger. He just nodded, "I agree." As Dan drove away, he exchanged a quick glance with Lily. Ethan, standing a little further away, noticed something in this look that further strengthened his resolve. Their small, almost secret smile, a certain spark that ran between them. He knew that after this night, Lily and Dan were now connected by secret memories, and this poisoned his soul. But he continued to play his role. An hour later, Lily returned to the house. She seemed to be in high spirits, as far as could be seen. I even tried to cook something tasty for dinner, although I usually wasn't particularly enthusiastic about cooking. But Ethan only made a few formal compliments to the dish and went to the bedroom, citing the fact that he was tired. At that moment, he felt that if he stayed with her a little longer, he might break down. Alone with himself, Ethan lay on the bed for a long time, staring at the ceiling. The brain could not let go of the scene that appeared before my eyes. Lily clinging to Dan, their sighs, muffled kisses. The calmness with which Lily now walks around the house seemed to be the clearest evidence of her cunning. Still, Ethan didn't want to throw her out of his life outright. He needed something more than just a divorce or a scandal. He wanted a reckoning that would satisfy his sense of justice and the pain of betrayal. From that day onwards, when Lily resumed her normal life, a time of false calm began. Ethan behaved evenly, but withdrew. Lily noticed this, but believed that her husband was simply in some kind of bad mood because of the bad weather or something else. She was too confident in the fact that her affair with Dan had gone unnoticed. It even seemed to her that she was cautious, forgetting about who exactly her husband was, a man with a heightened sense of surveillance and an understanding of how to find evidence. She had no idea what a hurricane of thoughts was raging in his head. The most difficult thing was to maintain the appearance of friendship with this person. But Ethan's army experience told him that endurance was one of the key virtues of a fighter. He resolutely joined this game because his honor and his pride were at stake. Lily, unsuspectingly, continued to smile as she received messages from Dan on her phone. Sometimes she went into another room to answer. Ethan could only coldly note this in his memory, waiting for the moment when he would declare himself, no longer hiding the knowledge of her infidelity. But now, on the contrary, he created the illusion that he did not understand anything. Soon the weather in Wyoming changed. The winds became stronger, the days became shorter, and the forest stuck its bare branches into the gray sky. When the leaves had almost fallen, the area around the ranch took on a bleak and somewhat dreary appearance. Lily seemed to be bored again, but now it was a special kind of boredom. Sometimes, when she thought Ethan wasn't noticing, a faint smile would touch her lips, as if she was remembering something pleasant, most likely meeting Dan. Ethan was in no hurry to bring her to light. He bided his time, continuing to behave outwardly coldly, but without obvious aggression. He began to disappear more and more in his garage, where, under the guise of fixing equipment, he spent hours thinking about something. There, in the depths of the steel lockers, his military equipment was stored. Special knives once received in the army, several walkie-talkies, and even a pair of hidden cameras that he had once adapted for security at the ranch. Ethan, being prudent, equipped his property with video surveillance elements during the construction phase. The cameras were not of the highest class, but they were quite suitable for recording movement in the area. One rainy evening, when Lily went to town for shopping, he decided to look through old camera footage. He once placed a couple of them in such a way that he could overlook the backyard and the guest house where visiting guests usually spent the night. The entire system was hidden in a utility room where the equipment was located a receiver connected to a computer. Lily didn't know all the details because Ethan had never told her about it in detail. She was not interested, and he did not consider it necessary to initiate her into all security issues. Sitting down in a dimly lit room, Ethan connected the monitor and began calling up archival recordings. Frames popped up on the screen. Here he was walking the dogs. Here a car with food arrived. He scrolled further, and suddenly Lily appeared. The pictures were not very clear, but clear enough to make out the figures. In one of the recordings, dated several weeks earlier, Ethan saw Lily walking out towards the guest house late at night, followed a few minutes later by Dan. Just a few seconds later, the lights in the house go out. They stayed inside for about an hour, and then Dan returned to the main house, and Lily stayed there for a while longer. The episode had no sound, but even the silent film spoke for itself. Ethan found it difficult to breathe as he watched this type of material. A shiver ran down his spine from the realization of how many times they could meet in the guest house while he was minding his own business or was away. Their explanations from yesterday or the day before came to mind. I'll take out the garbage on the street. I'll clear my head before going to bed, and so on. All these little lies, which once could have been mistaken for trifles, now added up to one whole a series of shameless dates. When he scrolled further through the archive, it turned out that Lily and Dan made similar visits more than once, almost every time Dan visited. Moreover, this also happened on those days when Ethan went away on business, leaving his wife alone. It turned out that sometimes they even arranged daytime meetings, probably confident that Ethan wouldn't suspect anything while he was in town. It was excruciatingly painful for Ethan to watch this, because he remembered how at those moments he returned home and saw the smile on Lily's face. She seemed nice, ordinary. Now he understood that she was smiling not only at him, but also at the memory of being in the arms of his best friend just a couple of hours ago. After viewing all the incriminating fragments, Ethan sat down, leaned back in his chair, and closed his eyes. Those frames appeared in front of him again and again. Lily, waving her hand invitingly at Dan, the barely noticeable touch of his palm on her waist at the entrance to the house, leaving together after more than an hour, then smiling faces. He wanted to smash this room into pieces. But he understood. The time for violent emotions had not yet come. Gathering his equipment, Ethan stepped out into the night air. The rain had almost stopped, and the faded moon sometimes peeked out from under the black clouds. He walked around the guest house, as if trying to understand how this place had become the center of betrayal. There weren't even any lights on inside. Lily was in town, and Dan was apparently at home. The usual rural silence reigned around. Ethan felt a shiver run through his hands as he imagined the next time Dan would come here. That's it. Now I won't let you leave just like that, he thought, clenching his fists. Such evenings and checking notes became a kind of painful ritual for Ethan, which helped him not to go crazy. With each new meeting between Lily and Dan he watched, he remembered past conversations with his wife in which she lied to his face. For example, that she needs to trim the roses behind the house, or check if she forgot the laundry in the house. There were always incredible reasons to retire to places where, as it turned out, Dan was already waiting for her. When Lily returned from trips to town or simply went to bed, Ethan would replay in his head until the morning their recent quarrels or doubts that he had once suppressed in himself. Now everything was confirmed. She was lying, looking into his eyes when he wondered why she had been absent for so long. A deceitful smile, an uncertain laugh, everything was playfully easy for her. And he, a gullible idiot, believed because he loved. He barely communicated with Lily about his plans. Seeing that her husband was walking gloomily, she tried to diffuse the situation, either by preparing delicious food or by offering to do household chores together. However, Ethan got off with short, "not now," or "we'll talk later." Lily was nervous at such moments, but more because of his bad mood than because of the thoughts that he might know everything. After all, by that time she had never caught his gaze, indicating that he was aware of her betrayal. Sometimes, however, she had slight suspicions he felt it from her uneven, sideways glances. But she quickly calmed herself down. About a week has passed since the last checks of the video recordings. Ethan endured without entering into open confrontation. He felt that he had to prepare everything. The first step was to invite Dan to a big, serious hunt. This event never looked suspicious. They had organized outings before, sometimes taking Lily with them, sometimes traveling together. But this time Ethan wanted to make sure that Lily did not go, and the hunt itself took place in that remote corner of the ranch that he had chosen in advance. One evening, when Lily allegedly went to a distant barn to sort out old things, Ethan himself dialed Dan's number. He answered cheerfully, immediately switching to a friendly tone as if nothing had happened. Ethan carefully copied his usual manner of communication. "Hello, Dan, I have an offer for you. I want to organize a real deer hunt. I have such locations where there are a lot of animals, but there are almost no people. What do you say?" Dan instantly lit up. "Of course, buddy, I'm always glad. When are you going?" "I think on the weekend. We'll head out Friday evening or early Saturday. We have a small hunting hut there, although I haven't checked it for a long time, but I think we can spend the night. Let's take horses to get further away. Maybe even stay for a couple of days if you want, and then we will return with excellent trophies." "Sounds great," Dan answered animatedly. "Finally, real hunting, and not these city duck raids. Seriously, I dreamed about this. Is Lily with us?" Ethan's heart sank, but he tried to keep his voice even. "Lily. Yes, she's been saying lately that she's tired. I don't think she's in the mood for hiking right now. In addition, the route is not easy. It's better to stay at home. This is not a walk, a serious matter." "Got it," Dan replied. "Actually, maybe it's better, in case she feels uncomfortable there. The two of us can handle this, just like the good old days." This, "in the good old days," pierced Ethan's soul like a knife. He remembered how he once truly considered Dan to be the closest person after his father, how he trusted him on the battlefield. And now this same brother-in-arms betrayed him and his wife. But Ethan restrained his emotions and only calmly confirmed, "Exactly, we'll manage." They agreed to call closer to the weekend to clarify the details and list of equipment. And in Ethan's soul, the thought flowed like a cold river. Soon you will find out what this last hunt of ours will be. When Lily returned to the living room, Ethan unobtrusively informed her that he was going with Dan to distant lands for a couple of days. She looked at him, raising her eyebrows slightly. "About? Why don't you take me?" Ethan shrugged in response. "There are no amenities there. It will be hard. We want to make our way along difficult trails, maybe even spend the night right in the forest. I don't think you'll like it." Lily sighed, trying to sound offended. "Okay, as you wish," she said, and there was a strange note in her voice. Lily probably quickly realized that being alone with Dan in the wilderness of a deserted area was a risk from the point of view of keeping their secret. However, she was sure that Ethan had no idea about anything, and Dan, most likely, feels completely safe and believes that their betrayal is hidden. The next day, Ethan began preparing his equipment. He pulled backpacks and hunting gear out of the garage and checked the tents. He also brought out several packages of provisions, a canteen, a compass, a walkie-talkie, plus additional ammunition for the shotgun and pistol he kept for self-defense. Everything looked quite normal for a man going on a long hunt. Lily passed by and saw his preparations, and occasionally asked, "Why do you need so many things?" Ethan jokes, "Just in case. After all, we will be leaving for a few days. Who knows what is there in the depths of the forest?" Sometimes, when Ethan was laying out the cards on the table, Lily would sit down with him. She, as if nothing had happened, asked, "Where will you set up camp? Will you have enough food? You can take my first aid kit." He answered her politely, albeit dryly. I looked at her and wondered how she could chat so dispassionately when, in fact, in her hands, it was a betrayal. Seeing her interesting, almost cheerful look, he thought that for her, it was all just part of life. Her husband was leaving, and she would continue her relationship with Dan, if not for the upcoming hunt, which would change everything. Closer to the weekend, Ethan called Dan again, clarifying the details. "Take warm clothes," he said. "It can be chilly there at night, and more ammunition for the gun if you want. We'll get ready on Friday afternoon and leave right away." They agreed that Dan would come to the ranch with his SUV, load some of his things, then get into Ethan's vehicle, perhaps a horse or an all-terrain vehicle, and together they would hit the road. The conversation was short and businesslike, but Dan said cheerfully in parting, "I feel like this will be the hunt of the year. Get ready to see my new trunk. I took it especially for large animals." Ethan smiled coldly as he replied, "I'm looking forward to it." After finishing the call, he put the phone on the table and looked around. Lily was sitting on the other side of the room, pretending to knit or something. He noticed how she was watching him out of the corner of her eye, trying to understand what they were talking about, but not daring to ask. Ethan, feeling the bitterness of the situation, simply went out onto the porch and took a deep breath of cold air. Thus ended the week before their journey. Ethan finally decided to inspect the horses and check the condition of the repair kit for the all-terrain vehicle. If the horses were too nervous, he could always drive part of the way and then walk, with Dan in tow. There were several horses on the ranch now, but Ethan preferred his chestnut stallion named Spark, a loyal and hardy animal accustomed to rough terrain. He looked after him carefully. He cleaned him, gave him more food, anticipating the future outing. Lily, watching this, still tried to ask something from time to time. "Are you really going to go that far? What if you need help?" Ethan briefly answered that they would have a walkie-talkie, and in general, "They are not beginners with Dan, we can handle it." At the same time, everything was seething in his soul. The cynicism of the situation amazed the imagination. He was preparing to kill a man, and his wife blithely asked whether it would be convenient for them to spend the night there. Every evening, before going to bed, he mentally worked out the details. Maybe arrange for Dan to accidentally get shot? No, too doubtful. It is necessary for the friend to realize that Ethan is doing this consciously and with full understanding of why. On the other hand, Dan cannot be given the opportunity to defend himself. Yes, he can shoot, but Ethan knows this area much better. Army training dictated, deprive the enemy of an advantage, do not leave him any chance of a sudden attack. In the future, Ethan planned to give him the opportunity to run around, like an animal being smoked out of the forest, so that he could feel the taste of fear and hopelessness. On Friday morning, Lily asked if he needed help getting ready. Ethan refused. "I've already packed everything, just waiting for Dan to arrive." She shrugged and said she was going to go into town. Ethan thought caustically that perhaps she was in a hurry to see Dan before he left on his camping trip. But he only asked in a voice, "When will you be back?" "By evening, not earlier," she answered. He nodded and went into the garage. If Lily meets Dan in town, so be it. Dan will still return to the ranch in the evening, and nothing will interfere with the plan. Let him admire him one last time, Ethan thought, feeling cold satisfaction from the thought that soon it would all be over. While Lily was away, Ethan finally packed his and Dan's things. He examined the weapon, making sure that the gun was adjusted perfectly and that the bolt did not jam. I checked the map, where I marked the places of abandoned tree trunks and crevices suitable for hiding. He brought order to the house, which he will leave behind after the implementation of his plans. The dogs were divided into enclosures, leaving instructions for a neighbor who could look after them if Ethan was delayed. Everything looked like the usual cautious approach to a long hunt. Thus, by Friday evening, everything was ready. Lily had not yet returned, and the sun was slowly sinking below the horizon, painting the sky in dark blues and oranges. Ethan sat on the porch, lighting a cigarette, waiting for Dan to arrive. "Soon," he whispered to himself in the silence, "soon you will arrive, my dear friend, and we will see how strong your courage really is when I drive you like an animal into a trap. I hope your last hunt is a memorable one." Dan got out of the car, saw Ethan on the porch, and waved his hand cheerfully. "Hello, ready for adventure?" Ethan chuckled slightly and stood up. "Ready," he said quietly. "Well, let's go. I'll show you where my equipment is." The first stripes of the faded sun appeared in the gray dawn sky, which had not yet had time to warm up the earth, which had cooled during the night. A cold wind enveloped Ethan's ranch, walking between the buildings and slightly rustling the remaining yellow leaves. At this hour, everything around was usually quiet, only the dogs could sometimes howl sadly or bark among themselves. But today the silence was broken by two voices coming muffledly from the direction of the garage Ethan and Dan were preparing to leave. They agreed to leave early so they could ride the long way to the far corner of the ranch, where, in Ethan's words, There's some real big game. Dan, who arrived the night before, acted casually. He cheerfully praised his new gun, said that he would finally really hunt, and told some jokes. Listen, Ethan, he asked matter-of-factly, pulling up his backpack. Is it really so remote where we're going? I heard that even locals rarely go there. They say there may be bears, wolves. It's not an easy place, Ethan answered quietly, looking at his interlocutor. But it's not easy to meet bears now. They've gone closer to the mountains, and wolves. Well, their packs roam everywhere, but you and I can handle it if anything happens. Besides, we have weapons. Let's put it this way, I wouldn't go there with a person I don't trust. Dan chuckled, taking the answer as a kind of compliment. So I've earned your trust, haha. Well, that's good to hear, bro. Let's get in the saddle, I can't wait to ride. The last words, bro and trust, echoed bitterly in Ethan's soul. He remembered how recently he considered this man, the most reliable comrade, almost a brother. Now, every time he heard casual jokes or friendly remarks from Dan, Ethan felt a cold determination growing inside him to see his plan through to the end. But nothing in appearance betrayed his inner state. His face remained calm, his voice measured, his movements precise, like those of a soldier who knows every step forward. They brought 2 horses out of the stable, a chestnut stallion named Spark for Ethan, and a sturdy bay mare named Red for Dan. Dan looked around. Where is Lily? Didn't you come out to see us off? She's still sleeping, Ethan lied, although in fact Lily had long since gotten up and was wandering around the house, not knowing whether she should show herself. It was a hard night. She had a migraine. I said let him rest. I see, Dan answered briefly. He wanted to say something else, but at the last moment he changed his mind and just shrugged. Perhaps, deep down, he felt more comfortable that Lily was not participating in the training camp. Fewer unnecessary questions, less stress. Having checked the harness, Ethan threw a heavy hunting backpack onto Spark's back, which, in addition to standard accessories, contained equipment whose purpose Dan had no idea, especially strong ropes, fastenings, a supply of cartridges, a folding shovel. Dan didn't pay attention to the fact that the backpack looked too heavy. He thought that Ethan was just used to taking everything with a reserve. Well, let's go. Ethan took the reins. We'll immediately move towards the southern ravine, then we'll move on to the path that leads deeper. I hope to spend the night at the edge of the forest. There is one old hunting hut there. Sounds great, Dan responded enthusiastically. I've been dreaming about a real adventure for a long time. With these words, he jumped into the saddle, stroked Red's neck, and lightly touched her sides. The mare snorted and took a couple of steps forward. Spark behaved calmer under Ethan, but Ethan immediately took control of his movements, habitually keeping the horse in rein. They walked through the backyard of the ranch, passing the dog pens. The dogs noticed the movement and started barking in unison, as if seeing them off. Ethan sensed that in some ways the dogs were anticipating anxiety, but that could have been just a coincidence. They were often turned on by any noise. Attention, Ethan shouted, half turning around, and the dogs calmed down, only quietly baring their teeth behind the net. So they moved towards the low hills that surrounded the back of the property. Dan jokingly noted, I never thought you had so much space here. I came all the time, sat closer to home, but it turns out that you have land, almost half the state. Yes, I like the space, Ethan answered calmly, but sometimes you need to explore it to understand what kind of wilderness it really is. They drove in silence for a good quarter of an hour, only occasionally exchanging words about the weather or what animals might be found in these places. Dan told how he read in a magazine about the rare white-tailed deer that are found in Wyoming, and admitted that he dreamed of getting a trophy. Ethan thought to himself, nothing, your dream will come true, though not at all the way you expect. But he only suggested out loud, if we're lucky, we can look for deer in the valley. There's a small river there. They often come to drink. Great, Dan beamed like a child in an amusement park. Maybe I'll have time to shoot a couple, and then, when we get back, we'll have a real celebration. Ethan had an impenetrable mask on his face. There will be a holiday, he thought. But not for you, Dan. As they drove further away, the landscape began to change. The hills became steeper, there were rocky areas in places, and the greenery gave way to bare tree trunks and withered bushes. It seemed that nature itself realized that a person rarely sets foot here. Sometimes from the depths of the forest came the cry of a bird similar to a hawk, and there were no other sounds except the steady clatter of hooves. You know, Dan suddenly began, driving closer to Ethan, I'm very glad that we got out together. Just like old times, right? Army comrades, damn it. You do understand that I have always valued our friendship, right? Ethan tensed, but didn't let himself break down. He just chuckled slightly. Yeah, I remember something like that. We used to say in the barracks in the evenings that after the service we would live normally, without unnecessary stress. Exactly. Dan laughed sincerely, patting himself on the thigh. And who would have thought that we would be sitting on horseback in the wild, looking for deer? Life has taken us in a twist. Yeah, cool, Ethan thought, but remained silent. An inner voice reminded him that they were indeed bound by strong ties, and the betrayal was all the more painful. He did not want to enter into reasoning, so as not to give away his thoughts. They still had a long journey ahead of them deep into the forest. They rode like this for almost the entire day, with breaks for short rests. Dan didn't seem to feel threatened at all. He was either humming something to himself, telling Ethan about the latest events in his business, or asking how things were going at the ranch. Ethan responded just enough to keep the conversation flowing and not seem too dry. Soon the sun began to set. They reached a place where a deep ravine with sparse trees began. The bottom of the ravine was rocky, and the darkening forest was already crowding along the edges. Here Ethan suggested stopping. Let's set up camp for the night. It is already dangerous to go further in the dark. You can easily get lost or damage the horses. We'll continue in the morning. I agree, Dan nodded. I'm a little tired. He looked around. A majestic but ominous silence reigned all around. Dan seemed to experience a slight thrill when he realized that they were in the middle of nowhere. But then his old bravado took over, and he said, but what a sky there will be at night. Probably the stars are visible better than in any cities. You'll see, Ethan answered shortly. They made a fire, tied the horses to the nearest trees, and removed some of the luggage. Ethan laid out a small tent under which they could sit by the fire. Dan helped, always joking. I hope our fire doesn't attract any wolves, Ethan shrugged. If the wolves were nearby, we would have heard them already. Don't worry, if anything happens, we have weapons. Yes, that's right, Dan patted his rifle, which was standing on a support. I've never shot at wolves, but I think I can handle it if necessary. Ethan looked into the darkened forest and said quietly, let's see. They dined on the modest supplies they had brought with them, dried meat, beans, and bread. We washed it down with tea from a thermos. Dan offered to open a flask of whiskey to warm up, but Ethan refused. I don't want to let my guard down. You never know what can happen in the night. What could happen here? Dan was surprised, but did not insist. He took a sip himself and winced. It's a rare, disgusting thing, but it's warming, damn it. Soon they seemed to have entered that stage when, after a long journey, a person gets tired and his soul is left with a feeling of pleasant exhaustion. Dan slowly began to doze off, putting a folded jacket under his head and placing the rifle next to him. Ethan sat near the fire, rocking on his haunches, watching the dancing tongues of fire rise and shower dry branches with sparks. A short-term wind either extinguished their ardor or fanned it with renewed vigor. He looked at Dan. He was already snoring by the fire, and Ethan felt a pang of hatred mixed with sad memories. They had once spent the night together like this, side by side, during their army service. Ethan would never have thought that one day his friend would betray him in the most basic way by climbing into bed with his wife. By dawn, the sky was covered with low, leaden clouds. They did not promise heavy rains, but they let in little light, causing the surrounding forest to plunge into damp semi-darkness. Ethan woke up first, immediately stood up, shaking off his chilly thoughts, and went up to the horses, checking their food and water. The horses calmly nibbled at the remains of the grass, sometimes raising their heads to look at their owners. Waking Dan up, Ethan said quietly, "It's time to go. We need to get to the forest hut I spoke about. There might be supplies there, and from there we'll start looking for deer." "Uh-huh." Dan rubbed his eyes, stood up, and yawned. "The fire gives me a slight headache. But it's okay, now let's warm up. Do we have anything to drink?" Ethan handed him a flask of water. "We ran out of coffee last night. We'll have to make do with water." "Okay." Dan took a few sips, trying to drive away the remnants of sleep, and returned the flask. "I fucking love this feeling when there is uncertainty ahead, and it depends on us what the result will be. Just like on a mission in the army, remember?" Ethan nodded briefly. "I remember." The strongest memory for him was the solidarity that reigned between them then. Now there is no trace left of her. Having gathered, they extinguished the fire, threw their backpacks on the horses, and moved on. Dan walked ahead, leading Red along the narrow path, while Ethan fell behind slightly, giving himself a moment to take in the surrounding forest. An hour later, the forest became noticeably denser. The branches of the trees closed overhead, letting in very little light. Moss hummocks and treacherous roots protruded from the ground, capable of easily tripping a horse. Soon it was difficult to distinguish the path, and Dan, looking around excitedly, asked, "Ethan, are you sure we're going the right way? I think we've lost our way." Ethan answered reluctantly, as if reluctantly. "There is no direct road here, but I remember the landmarks. We'll soon come out to a clearing by the stream, and there it's already not far from the hut." "Well, okay, I'll trust you," Dan snorted, but still remained cheerful. "If anything happens, send and saw signal to your Indians who live here." He laughed at the joke. Ethan remained silent. They went even further, overcoming fallen trees, sometimes stepping over windbreaks that they had to go around. In places, it was necessary to dismount to guide the horses carefully between the dense thickets. Finally, about 30 minutes later, they came to a small clearing from which a view of a gloomy thicket opened up. Among the trees, a little to the side, a dark silhouette of a building could be seen, a one-story hut, which once served hunters as shelter from the rain. Now it looked abandoned, overgrown with moss and lichen. The roof caved in, and the windows were partially blocked with boards. "Damn, that looks creepy," Dan commented, looking around the hut. "I hope there's no bear living there." "If he lives," Ethan grinned, "that means we'll kill him. Or we'll drive you away. Let's go see what's inside." They tied their horses to strong branches away from the entrance and headed towards the door of the hut. With a slight push, it opened with a creak. The inside smelled musty, the walls were covered in dust and cobwebs, and the only furniture was a rotten table and a couple of rickety stools. "Well, yes, the kingdom of spiders," Dan grumbled. "But no one seems to live. Apparently, the animals did not come here." Ethan walked inside and lightly tapped the butt of his gun on the wall, testing its strength. The floor creaked underfoot. "You can wait here if the weather gets worse. But we'd better move on while it doesn't rain," he said over his shoulder. "I wanted to bring you here first to show you what kind of house this is. The boys and I spent the night here once, a long time ago, but now I don't see any point in wasting time." "I agree." Dan looked around again and winced. "The nest is creaky. I wouldn't live here." They went outside, and it was here that Ethan decided it was time to take action. He glanced at the dark green forest that closed around them. There were no more landmarks here, and it would be extremely difficult for a person who did not know the area to find the way back. Ethan sighed, holding back the rage that was bursting out, and went to the horse. Dan followed him, saying, "Well, shall we move on? Maybe we can find that clearing where deer often graze." "Of course," Ethan replied, jumping into the saddle. He waved his hand to the northwest. "Over there, behind the ridge." They moved deeper again, and soon the thickets became even denser. The horses walked more carefully, snorting from the dampness. After walking a few hundred meters, Ethan noticed that the forest surrounded them on all sides with indifferent silence, and the only sound was the intermittent breathing of horses and the crunch of branches under their hooves. At some point, Ethan stopped abruptly. Dan, who did not expect this, drove forward a little. He turned around. "What's happened?" Ethan leaned toward Dan as if he wanted to whisper something important. "Wait a minute," he said in the tone of an intrigued hunter. "I thought I saw something behind the bushes on the right." "Beast." Dan perked up. He slid from the saddle, holding his rifle at the ready. "Where exactly?" "There," Ethan pointed with his hand towards the dense thickets. "Walk quietly, and I will go around on the other side. Maybe deer." Dan, still inspired, nodded and carefully moved towards the bushes. He waited a couple of seconds, then dismounted and, leaving Spark, slowly followed. Between them there were thickets. Visibility was poor, and Dan could not see Ethan. The branches rustled underfoot, and somewhere in the distance a blackbird or magpie uttered an alarming cry. Ethan, clutching his gun, leaned against the tree trunk and, out of the corner of his eye, saw Dan's back, who was intensely peering into the thicket. And of course, there is no beast there, Ethan thought, and raised his gun, slowly pointing the barrel at the silhouette of a man whom he had recently considered a friend. He wanted to shout something, denounce, vent his anger, but army training dictated. The first shot should deprive the enemy of calm, but not kill him. Ethan wanted Dan to understand that it was no joke. He pulled the trigger. A shot rang out, reverberating off the trees. The bullet flew a few centimeters from Dan and whistled as it crashed into the trunk of an oak tree. The bark shattered, falling to the side. Dan, stunned, fell sharply to the ground, pressing his face down against it. "Hey, Ethan!" He heard a cry full of panic. "What are you doing?" Ethan, without lowering his gun, stepped out from behind the tree and, trying to maintain a cold tone, answered, "What do you think I'm doing, buddy?" Dan slowly turned on his side, fearfully searching for Ethan. Shock showed on his face. He did not understand what was happening and tried to find at least some explanation. Were you aiming at me? What is this, a prank?" Dan almost moaned, still lying on the ground. "Look at the tree where the bullet went," Ethan said, coming closer. "Do you think this is a joke? I could get inside your head if I wanted to." Dan watched in horror as Ethan held the gun pointed directly at him. Just yesterday they were friends, traveling side by side. Now there was something dark and sinister burning in Ethan's eyes. Dan tried to get up frantically, but Ethan barked, "Don't move, or the next bullet will not enter the barrel, but into your flesh." Dan's heart was pounding. He couldn't understand why Ethan was so mad at him. Thoughts raced through my head. Maybe he's gone crazy. Maybe these are the effects of stress. He opened his mouth to say something, but his tongue refused to obey. "Ethan, explain what's going on," Dan managed, breathing heavily. The answer sounded cold, like a shot. "I don't need an explanation. I saw everything. I know everything. I saw you having fun with my cheating wife. Now get up, but slowly. Throw away your gun and knife." Dan froze, as if the words were taking some time to reach him, and then his face twisted in understanding horror. He didn't know exactly what Ethan was talking about, but deep down he guessed that he was talking about Lily, about their secret meetings. The blood drained from his cheeks, and he whispered, Damn, Ethan, listen. It's not what you think." "Be quiet," Ethan interrupted him, still holding the gun at gunpoint. "Drop your weapon, otherwise I will shoot." Dan, continuing to look at the blackening barrel of the gun, with trembling hands, took his weapon from his shoulder and carefully laid it on the ground. He was followed by a hunting knife, which he pulled from its sheath at his belt. Here, I laid it all out. Ethan, let's talk. I'll talk whenever I want. In the meantime, step forward to those trees. Slowly. Don't you dare run." "Okay," Dan muttered, straightening up on stiff legs. I won't run." He looked back at his abandoned weapon, but understood. He had no chance of grabbing it and shooting first. Ethan kept his distance and looked collected, while Dan trembled with fear. Lord, he thought, we are friends. Why? What to do? He had no doubt that Lily was the reason, but he still hoped that Ethan would not go further than threats. Perhaps he just wants to intimidate me, beat me up, but not to kill. He's a normal person, not a murderer. Forward, Ethan repeated in a commanding tone. To these oak trees, see. Yes, yes. Dan stumbled towards the indicated group of trees. Ethan followed him, weapon at the ready. His every movement was perfected, as if he were in a combat situation. At some point, Dan noticed a flash of painful vindictiveness in his eyes. Ethan, friend, please. He began, but Ethan cut him off again. Shut up. I have no desire to listen to your lies. I was silent for a long time, but now, that's it. The end of your beautiful life. Dan wanted to object, to say that this was a mistake, but his heart sank with horror. He felt that he was trapped, without weapons, in the wilderness, without hope of help. Ethan seemed like a ruthless beast who had planned this in advance. Shit, Dan thought, we need to get out somehow. But any impulse to escape could cost him his life. Ethan shot accurately, and the forest, even wild, would not cover him 100%. However, fear pushed him to the idea that he needed to look for a chance. And while they are not so far from the horses, maybe they can try. Stand against the tree with your back to me, Ethan ordered as Dan approached the oak tree. Ethan. Dan breathed, feeling the world spinning before his eyes. Stop. Dan stopped, realizing that in just a few more seconds Ethan would be able to pull the trigger. Take off your backpack if you have one. Turn your pockets out slowly. I want to make sure you don't have a gun. I don't have, Dan began. Do as I say. Dan's hands, trembling, unzipped the backpack. Then he carefully threw it on the ground and took out the contents of his pockets, a lighter, a couple of cartridges, and rags. Ethan took a quick look at it, made sure there was no gun, and nodded. Fine. Now go straight along this slope. Went. And remember, one sharp gesture and you will get a bullet. Dan glanced sideways at Ethan, trying unsuccessfully to see if he would actually shoot. Previously, he would not have believed that his friend was capable of this. But the scene with the bullet hitting the tree already showed that Ethan was not joking. With a heavy heart, Dan walked up the slope, out of breath and wondering how to get out. Perhaps if Ethan gets close, he will be able to suddenly attack and take the gun away. But the chances are slim. Ethan is larger, and he has military training. Climbing the steep slope, Dan realized that he could not go on forever, following Ethan's orders. If he does not attempt to escape, he may lose his life right here in the deep forest. Let there be a small chance of survival if he at least tries to disappear into the thickets. He looked for the right moment when the trees became thicker and the grass became taller. After about 10 minutes of this ascent, they found themselves in a place where the slope dropped to a small hollow overgrown with dense bushes. If I jump there and quickly run through the bushes, Dan thought, maybe Ethan won't hit me in the back. Reason told him it was risky. Ethan was a great shot. But panic and the instinct of self-preservation pushed me to take a crazy step. When they crossed a row of pine trees, Dan suddenly took off, jumping towards the cliff. Ethan, walking a few meters behind, only managed to shout, "Stop!" before Dan disappeared into the thick foliage. Almost immediately a shot rang out. The bullet passed by, hitting the branches. Dan, bending over, ducked deeper into the bushes. Another shot rang out behind him, cutting off the tops of the leaves next to his ear. Adrenaline overwhelmed the consciousness. Run! Run! He fell down the slope, pushing himself with his hands. The thorns dug into the skin, the branches whipped in the face. Somewhere high above, he heard Ethan's furious voice. He shouted something, but due to the noise of his own breathing, Dan could only make out individual words. Stop. You can't run away. The image of Ethan with a gun flashed before his eyes. God, he really wants to kill me, the thought flashed. Having reached a relatively flat area, Dan tried to get his bearings. Where to run? The forest stretched for many kilometers. He did not know any roads. No compass, no weapons. But staying put is certain death, because Ethan seems to know every stone and path. Dan frantically wiped the blood from his forehead. Apparently, he had managed to scratch himself. There was fog spreading among the trees ahead, and he decided to rush there while there was a chance to hide in the haze. The shot was heard again, echoing through the forest. Can he really see me? Dan was horrified, ducking down. The bullet passed with an incomprehensible whistle somewhere to the side. He ran, shuddering at every step, expecting lead to plunge into his back. But for several seconds nothing happened except the loud beating of his heart against his ribs. Come on, run! Ethan's cry reached him, as if mockingly. I'll give you a head start. The words sounded almost otherworldly. Dan didn't believe that someone could chase him like that with a gun and mock him at the same time. It seemed crazy, but perhaps Ethan had awakened an animalistic vindictiveness that made him enjoy the chase. Lord, what should I do? Dan's mind was racing. I'll try to get to the horses, the thought flashed. But he had no idea where they were. He ran at random, pushing through branches, squelching on the wet ground, risking breaking his leg every second. Cautious steps were heard behind him. Ethan walked leisurely, as if he knew that the victim would drive himself into a dead end. Dan looked back, but because of the fog and dense trees, he did not see his pursuer. All I could hear was branches breaking one after another, as if someone were calmly walking, tracking him down. Finally, Dan emerged into a small clearing surrounded by windbreaks. He quickly realized that it was a dead end. On three sides there was a wall of fallen trees and thorny thickets, and the fourth side was a steep, rocky slope. Crap, he swore. In such a place, it is easy to press it against the wall. Turning, he rushed to the right, hoping to get around the windfall. But he had only taken a few steps when a shot rang out from there. The bullet ripped up the ground at his feet, causing him to jump back. Don't rock the boat, said Ethan's familiar voice. I see you. If you take another step, the next shot will be in the knee. Dan stopped abruptly, raising his hands as if that could save him. Please, Ethan. Let's talk, he shouted, peering into the fog. I'll explain everything. We didn't want to. Shut up, the voice cut off, and the silhouette of a tall man with a gun at the ready appeared through the haze. Ethan moved closer, but still kept his distance so Dan couldn't attack him. A strange fire burned in his eyes. If you wanted to talk, you should have thought earlier. Dan swallowed convulsively. It's because of Lily, right? He squeezed out. I understand that we hurt you, but believe me this. Shut up. Ethan almost growled, pointing the barrel in Dan's direction. Do you think I came here to listen to your excuses? I saw everything with my own eyes. Dan lowered his head, unable to find words, although his heart screamed. Save your life. Do something. Listen, Ethan, he whispered, trying to speak more quietly. I understand what it looks like. But if you kill me, it's a prison. It's life over. You can't. Ethan laughed, short, cruel. But Dan began, feeling the muscles in his legs weaken. We're friends. You don't really want this. I see. Inside you are a good person. It was, Ethan corrected, until you cross all boundaries. You had my wife behind my back and came to my house. Do you think this can be forgiven? Tears of horror welled up in Dan's eyes. He didn't know what to answer. He muttered quietly. I beg you, give me a chance. I will leave everything. I will never appear with you again, I swear. I will do whatever you say. I'll give you money if you need it. Just don't kill me. Ethan looked at him with narrowed eyes and shook his head. No, I don't need your money, but I'll give you a chance to run. You can try to save yourself if you can. A hard smile touched his lips. I promise to give you a head start. Well, do you want to run? Ethan repeated. Yes. Dan squeezed out, taking a step back. Thank you. Don't thank me. You'll regret that you didn't die right away. With these words, Ethan slightly shook the gun, hinting that Dan might move out. He didn't force himself to beg. He rushed into the nearest bushes. His eyes were filled with tears. He didn't know where he was running. I just wanted to get away from Ethan. If only he didn't shoot now, the thought pounded in his brain. Ethan let him break away a few meters and only then raised his gun, aiming at the running figure. This time he decided not to shoot in the air. The bullet struck Dan's leg, leaving a shallow wound, but enough to make him scream and fall, rolling down the slope. "Ah," he groaned, clutching at the torn fabric of his pants. Blood was already appearing on his thigh. The pain was acute, but still tolerable. He managed to get up, screamed in despair, and limped on. Ethan's hoarse voice came from behind. "Run, run, while you can." Blood flowed in a thin stream. His leg hurt with every step, but Dan understood. To stop would be to die. You need to find shelter, bandage the wound, consider your chances. Somehow he continued moving. The forest remained just as impassive. Huge centuries-old trees stretched to the sky, roots protruding from the soil. Sometimes Dan would cling to branches to avoid falling. He didn't look back, afraid to see Ethan on his tail. The pain in my leg kept reminding me of itself, causing me to grind my teeth. "Damn it," Dan said, trying to hold on to the ledges. Another second, and he loses his balance and quickly flies down. The thud of his back hitting the ground knocked the air out of his lungs. Dan couldn't breathe for a few seconds, then coughed. I tried to get up, my legs were shaking, my head was spinning, but it seemed like I didn't break anything completely. To the left, a stream gurgled, obscured by overhanging branches. "Maybe you can hide there." Dan crawled on all fours, then stood up and, limping, walked forward, hoping to find some kind of shelter. The water is shallow but cold. He entered it, hiding behind a fallen trunk, trying to muffle his own breathing. "You won't run far. The forest is my territory, and you, pathetic bastard, will soon realize that you have no chance." Dan tried to cover his mouth so as not to breathe loudly. My heart was beating like crazy. He knew that sooner or later Ethan would find a way around or down. But maybe he has a few minutes of head start to move along the stream and get to a more passable place. He gathered his will into a fist, cursing the pain, and walked along the shore, leaving blood stains behind him, which the water partially washed away. Sometimes he stopped, listening. What if Ethan was nearby? But all I heard was the splash of the stream and the rustling of leaves. He walked like this for probably several hundred meters. There were stones, fallen trees, and thickets. Finally, I came to a flatter area. Here the stream widened, becoming a shallow river with clayey banks. Dan looked out from behind the trunk. No one was visible around, but this did not mean that Ethan was not nearby. "Lord, help me," Dan whispered, feeling his strength running out. He lost too much blood from the wound, and the blows from the fall took their toll. A treacherous trembling weakened the body. "We need at least some dressing material, but everything is left in the backpack." "We urgently need to stop the bleeding," flashed through my head. He fumbled for a strip of fabric on his shirt, tore it off with tears of pain, and somehow wrapped it around his thigh, pulling it tight. At least some measure. The bandage looked pathetic, but it was better than nothing. At that moment, as Dan sat gritting his teeth, a familiar voice came from behind the bushes. "I see you, Dan. I hid well, I don't argue, but not well enough." Dan shuddered and looked up. Above him, a few meters away, stood Ethan, wet hair, tense muscles, eyes burning with fierce hatred. The gun was lowered, but could have been raised at any moment. Dan's body shook treacherously. He realized that there was no salvation, but fear pushed me to the last attempt. Clenching his fists, he suddenly rushed forward, trying to knock Ethan down. He didn't stand a chance in a one-on-one fight, but sometimes desperation works wonders. But Ethan was expecting a jerk. He quickly jumped to the side, and the butt of the gun hit Dan on the shoulder with force. He fell to his knees, gasping. "Don't try," Ethan said dryly. "It's pointless." Dan felt like he no longer had the strength to resist. A pain in the leg, a blow to the shoulder, everything merged into one fierce attack of suffering. He looked up at Ethan, despair in his eyes. "Will you kill me?" "I'll think about it," Ethan answered coldly. "First, I'll make you feel what I felt. Pain, fear, humiliation." Dan closed his eyes, tears streaming down his dirty cheeks. He understood that this was only the beginning of a harsh reckoning. Even though Dan was in Ethan's hands, the hunt continued. Ethan didn't want to just take it and kill it. No, he wanted more revenge. He wanted Dan to feel like a hunted animal, so that fear would penetrate every cell of his consciousness. Leaning towards Dan, he hissed, "Get up. Let's move on. If you try to run, you will get a bullet in the other leg." "For what?" Dan whispered, trying to understand Ethan's logic through his tears. "Why do you need this?" "Because I want you to appreciate what it means to lose everything. What it's like to be trapped. What it's like to realize that you are a victim and your executioner no longer feels anything but contempt for you." I'm sorry," Dan said hoarsely. "It was a mistake. A terrible mistake. Error. You slept with my wife all the time, came to my house, smiled in my face, told stories. This is not a mistake, but a conscious choice." With these words, Ethan pulled Dan by the collar and forced him to stand up. He wheezed in pain, but obeyed. Limping, hand pressed to his hip, he followed Ethan. They emerged from the thickets to a more level part of the forest, where the soil was covered with a thick layer of pine needles. "Go ahead," Ethan ordered. "Not too fast, but don't stop either." "Where?" Dan asked, his voice brittle. "I don't care where. Just go. If you try to hide behind a tree, I'll shoot." Dan, hanging his head, trudged forward. Ethan walked a few steps away, controlling his distance so as not to give Dan the opportunity to attack unexpectedly. With each passing minute, the acute pain in his leg sapped Dan's strength more and more. Sweat rolled down my face and my head was spinning. The earth shook under my feet and my ears were ringing. He understood that he would not last long like this. "Wait," he wheezed, staggering. "Let me bandage the wound properly, or at least rest." "Should I rest?" Ethan looked at him with contempt. "Who will give me a break from your lying grins, from your betrayal? Walk." "But—" Dan began, and then Ethan fired into the air. I said, "Ankle," he growled. Stunned by the shot, Dan, shuddering, convulsively continued moving. His lips were trembling, his eyes were full of tears from fear and pain. The forest around them seemed like an endless labyrinth, and Ethan acted as a merciless taskmaster who willingly punished the slightest disobedience. "You wanted to hunt, didn't you?" Dan suddenly heard a mocking voice behind him. "Well, let's hunt. Now you are a game." After about 10 minutes, Dan began to stumble more and more often, barely moving his legs. Strength was running out, and blood continued to ooze from the wound. He grabbed the trunk of a thin tree to keep from falling. I can't take it anymore," he croaked, feeling like he was losing consciousness. "You can," Ethan snapped sternly. "Or would you prefer that I finish you off right here?" "No." Dan squeezed out. "Give me a couple of minutes. Just a little bit." Instead of answering, Ethan watched silently as Dan dropped heavily to his knees, pressing his hand to his thigh. Ethan's gaze remained cold, but something deep in his soul trembled for a moment, a memory of a past friendship. However, hatred and the burning consciousness of betrayal quickly drowned out this feeling. Having commanded, "Sit, but don't you dare try to run away," Ethan stepped aside, checked the clip of the gun, and looked around. Dan tried to somehow bandage the wound, tightening the already blood-soaked flap tighter. The pain seemed to recede slightly, turning into a dull numbness. A vague plan was forming in my head. Maybe when Ethan is distracted, I'll throw something at him. But what to throw? There is only a branch or a stone at hand, and most likely Ethan will have time to shoot. After a minute, Ethan turned to him. "Get up. Let's move on. I don't want you to die so quickly." Dan covered his face with his hand, sobbing. "Ethan, this is crazy. You're torturing me. Please stop." "Enough?" Ethan chuckled. "Do you feel sorry for yourself? Did I feel sorry when I saw you and Lily hugging in my guest house while I stood outside the door?" At the mention of Lily, Dan began to tremble. He suddenly realized that it was all over. Ethan knew absolutely everything. Again, he asked, "We didn't mean to. It happened that way. Please forgive me." "Be silent." Ethan barked and hit him in the back with the butt of his gun. Dan screamed and fell on his stomach. Ethan immediately put his foot on his back, pinning him down. "I don't want to listen to your lies. Get up and move, otherwise." Having gathered the last of his strength, Dan stood up, staggering, and moved again, carefully averting his gaze from Ethan. He cursed himself for this whole story with Lily, but it was too late. Punishment was inevitable. So the chase continued, although technically they walked together. Dan in front, Ethan behind, but each step could be Dan's last. From time to time he tried to look for a moment to duck into the bushes, but Ethan read his thoughts and warned, "If you try to escape, I'll shoot you." Finally, in the clearing where they came out, Dan could no longer walk. His legs gave way, and he fell to his knees, gasping for air. "Ethan, that's it, I can't." He managed. "Kill me if you want, but you can't go any further." Ethan stopped a few meters away and aimed his gun at Dan. He closed his eyes, expecting a bullet. But only quiet steps were heard approaching him. Dan opened his eyes slightly. Ethan was standing nearby, peering into his exhausted, bloody face. "You seem to have realized that there is no point in running," he said with a kind of tired ruthlessness. "Yes," Dan answered, breathing convulsively. "Spare me, if there is even a drop of humanity left in you." Ethan looked down at him, painfully remembering how they once saved each other's lives in battle together. Now he wanted to pierce him with a bullet, but he felt that this was preceded by another act of humiliation that Dan must endure. "Get up," Ethan finally ordered. "I have a better idea. Let's go there, to those fir trees. Do you see a small ledge on the ground?" Dan looked up and saw that a few tens of meters away was a mound strewn with pine needles. He nodded, not understanding what Ethan was up to. A sickening premonition stirred in my soul. Approaching the mound, Ethan threw onto the ground a small backpack that he had carried with him. Opening it, he took out a shovel with a folding handle. Dan saw this and became cold. The solution came instantly. Ethan would force him to dig a grave my grave. "Get to work," Ethan said evenly. "Dig a hole. 1.5 meters deep, wide enough to fit your corpse." "No." Dan breathed out, unable to believe what was happening. "Ethan, please, this is too much. Either dig or I'll shoot you right now. Choose." Dan's hands began to shake. The sound of the shovel hitting the ground echoed loudly in the quiet forest. Dan, groaning and groaning, began to dig, throwing the earth aside. The ground was wet, saturated with roots and pebbles, so that every bayonet was difficult to achieve. My thigh was throbbing, and it was getting harder to breathe. But Ethan watched him with a cold, narrowed eye, sometimes raising his gun if Dan tried to slow down too much. "Lord, for what?" Dan sobbed, taking out another portion of earth. "I didn't believe that you were capable of this." "You forced me to do this," Ethan responded. "I warned myself that I would never kill unless necessary. But your betrayal was the last straw for me." Dan shook his head, tears dripping onto the wet ground. He crawled in the hole, already digging a small ditch. A few minutes later, he became dizzy and fell against the wall of the pit, gasping for breath. "Enough, I can't take it anymore." Ethan sighed and looked into the depths of the grave. It was enough to put a person there, but he was in no hurry to give the command to stop. "Go on," he said, "a little deeper." Dan tried to argue, but saw Ethan raise an eyebrow. I had to continue. The shovel slammed into the ground again, pushing out clouds that fell along the edges of the hole. Dan sobbed quietly, not believing that he had reached such a terrible end, digging his own grave at the gunpoint of his former best friend. But reality was merciless. A few minutes later, Dan was completely exhausted and fell to his knees, holding a shovel in his hand. His chest was shaking, his leg was bleeding heavily. Everything. Everything. No strength. He looked up painlessly at Ethan, who stood on the edge of the pit, aiming his gun. At one point, when Dan was standing in a hole almost waist deep, Ethan crossed his arms over his chest and said, "I hope you understand how I felt when I saw you betraying me. I watched the recordings from the cameras. I installed them before for safety, and you yourself got into my trap." Dan, who could barely stand, sobbed. I'm sorry. I didn't think." "Of course, I didn't think so. You took away my sense of security." Ethan's voice sounded ominously calm. and now I'm taking your piece." Dan fell to his knees, clutching the shovel. When he looked up at Ethan with a blurred gaze, he saw only a cold face on which not a trace of his former friendship remained. "You slept with my wife," Dan remembered his last harsh words. "Now be a game." Damn, he said this when he was shooting past, giving him a head start. "Well," Ethan finally said, looking at the hole, "the depth is already right. Enough." Gathering his remaining strength, Dan strained to get out of the hole, but Ethan pinned him back with the butt of his gun. "Stop. Who said I'm letting you get out? Please." Dan moaned, feeling all his muscles trembling. "I understood everything. I will never." "Be silent," Ethan interrupted again. "You're disgusting, and I don't want to hear your excuses." With these words, he cast a sharp glance into the pit, as if deciding to take the last step. A hurricane was raging in Ethan's soul. He wanted to complete the job, but he was broken. His hands were clutching the gun, but it seemed that something inside was struggling with the thirst for blood. Dan, not noticing this, shouted in tears, "Please, don't kill. Leave me in this forest, hurt me whatever, but don't kill me. I don't want to die." Ethan looked at him without moving. His gaze wandered over Dan's wet hair, over his blood-stained thigh, over his jacket covered in earth. So much humiliation, fear. This is exactly what Ethan wanted from him to make him feel insignificant. But is he ready to commit murder with his own hands? Images from the army, where he had to shoot at enemies, surfaced in his memory. There was a war there. And now, murder for personal reasons. Ethan suddenly realized that his fingers were shaking on the trigger. He raised his gun, aimed at Dan's head, and growled, "Don't move." Dan held his breath and closed his eyes, preparing for the fatal shot. But the seconds dragged on, and the shot did not ring out. Ethan stood there, petrified, looking at him. "Come on," Dan groaned, covered in tears. "Make up your mind, or—" "Quiet," Ethan hissed, his voice suddenly filled with fight. Closing his eyes for a moment, he raised the barrel, but did not pull the trigger. The anger and adrenaline that had been boiling inside him all these days began to recede, leaving an emptiness. The forest was silently waiting for the outcome. There was almost no wind, only raindrops slowly falling from the leaves. "I have to," Ethan whispered, not knowing who he was talking to, maybe himself. In the pit, Dan was sobbing, curled up in a ball. His face was pale, his lips were blue, and blood continued to drip from his torn trouser leg. "Ethan, I didn't choose this," he whispered, remembering any words to beg for life. "Sorry." Ethan's throat tightened. "This is the moment of truth," I mentally said to myself. "Either I kill, or what then?" He took a deep breath and suddenly jerked the gun aside. He threw it to the ground so that it almost went off, and angrily hit the pile of earth with his boot. Dan, his mouth slightly open, watched as Ethan, breathing heavily, dropped to one knee, covering his face with his hands. "Get out," Ethan said quietly. "Get out of there. If you want, get out. I don't care." Dan didn't understand at first, thinking it was a trick. But he saw. Ethan looked away, looking somewhere to the side, gritting his teeth. "Really?" Dan whispered, not believing. "Leave before I change my mind," Ethan roared, again breaking into a furious intonation. "But you won't find horses. There's no connection. Survive yourself if you can. I'll leave you here. Eat the earth. You dug it for yourself." A faint spark of hope flashed in Dan's eyes. He stood up, crawled halfway out of the hole, then froze, listening. Had Ethan pointed the gun at him again? But he saw that Ethan was sitting, turning away, as if he was afraid to look at him. "Ethan," he began, but he growled, "don't you dare say my name again. Can you hear me? I don't want your apology, and I don't want to listen to anything. Your life is now in your hands. Maybe you'll die from your wounds, maybe you'll get out, and I'm leaving." Dan, sobbing, looked over the hole. For the first time in all this time, I felt freer, although exhausted. "Okay, He couldn't say anything intelligible. Ethan stood up and grabbed the gun without looking at Dan. His hands were shaking slightly, anger and adrenaline were still raging in his blood. But he could no longer finish off the man he had known for so many years, no matter how hard he tried. Everything inside was torn to pieces, but the fatal shot never sounded. "Are you throwing me in a hole?" Dan asked dully. "Do what you want," Ethan replied, shaking his head. "If you stay there, you will wait for death. If you try to get out, you'll have to dodge yourself. Look, you'll get by if you don't die on the way." With these words, he turned and walked away, slowly, as if in a daze. Dan waddled heavily, crawled halfway out of the muddy hole, and shouted after him, "Ethan, don't go like that. Help me." But Ethan didn't turn around. He only mechanically raised his hand to his forehead, as if saying goodbye, and disappeared into the thickets leading back to the clearing where the horses remained. His heavy steps were heard, breaking the branches, and after a minute or two the forest again plunged into oppressive silence. Ethan moved through the thick brush towards where they had left the horses, his mind still wavering between rage and devastation. He couldn't shake the feeling that revenge had brought no relief. Yes, he humiliated Dan, forced him to dig a grave, brought him to a state of animal fear. But now he understood that crossing the line of murder, a completely different step. "Am I a weakling?" he whispered, emerging into the clearing where Spark and Red stood. "No, I'm just not ready to be an executioner." The horses snored alarmedly, catching the pungent smell of gunpowder and sweat. Ethan walked up to them and stroked Spark's neck. Thoughts were swirling in my head. What now? How to live with what you did? I left him in the forest, wounded, half dead. Maybe this is worse than death. But if he survives, he won't dare come back. Scattered on the ground were Dan's bags, his supply of ammunition, and a small bag of food. Ethan carried them aside, not wanting to take away someone else's property. Let Dan try to get there, if he can crawl out to this clearing. But Ethan didn't want to stay here for another minute. Only for a moment did pity stir in my soul. If I had returned and shown the way, perhaps he would have survived without consequences. But the memory of how Dan passionately hugged his wife was sobering again. No, let him sort it out himself. Climbing onto Spark, Ethan took Red by the reins. After all, Dan would not return, at least today. With a short movement of his tongue, he encouraged the horses, and they slowly walked away. Ethan's legs, sitting in the saddle, were trembling from fatigue and internal shock. He felt he was losing a part of himself that was uncompromisingly honest. But looking forward at the gray tree trunks, he repeated, "It's necessary, he deserves it." The forest didn't make a sound. It seemed that the trees themselves were indifferent to the human tragedy that was taking place under their crowns. Where Dan was left was only a few miles away, and perhaps within an hour he would be heard moaning or calling for help. But Ethan had no intention of returning. He led the horses step by step, climbing the ridge before descending into a more familiar area and returning to the ranch. The rain began to fall harder, leaving dampness on the branches. Low clouds pressed as if they promised a storm. Ethan still had the image in his mind. Dan standing in a hole knee-deep in mud, tears mixed with blood. Even now, when he decided not to kill, the memory did not let go. "Where do I get so much cruelty?" Ethan asked himself. The army taught him to be cold-blooded, but something like this. It was a release of emotions accumulated from betrayal, and he realized that he would never be the same again. "Good hunting," he smiled bitterly, stroking Spark's rough mane. "We were looking for deer, but in the end, he became game." The evening haze was already shrouding the ranch when Ethan arrived at the gate. The journey from the far corner of his property took longer than usual due to rain and washed-out ground. Spark was tired, and Dan's horse, Red, he led by the reins almost mechanically, not imagining what would happen next to this animal. Nevertheless, he still made it to the yard wet, exhausted, with cold frozen in his eyes. I met him on the porch Lily. She ran out as soon as she heard the sound of hooves and saw that her husband had arrived alone. Or rather, without Dan by his side. There was anxiety mixed with relief on her face. She was clearly afraid that something had gone wrong, but hoped to do without a scandal. Lily glanced at the horses and noticed that one of them was the same one on which her lover was leaving. Ethan. She began running up. Where is Dan? I... I was worried why it took you so long. Ethan dismounted without looking at her. His face was inscrutable. He held Spark's reins and his other hand held Red's. Lily glanced at the mare, who snorted quietly, noticeably nervous at the absence of her usual rider. Can you hear me? Lily raised her voice, her heart beating faster. Where is Dan? What's happened? He stood silently, breathing heavily after a long journey. Thoughts were boiling in my head. She was not waiting for me, but for him. But Ethan stubbornly clenched his jaw, not wanting to answer. It seemed to him that any word spoken would now be empty. Pain throbbed in my temples from tension. The whole day and the entire hunt resounded with a resounding emptiness. Lily took his sleeve. Ethan, say something. I'm worried. You left together, but returned alone. Where's Dan? The word worried stung Ethan with cynical ridicule. She's worried. About whom? For a husband or a lover? He abruptly pulled Lily's hand away, stepped a little to the side, and tied the horses to a post. Then he turned to her and, looking gloomily, he left, urgently. The tone of the voice was icy, and the content itself was almost deathly. How did he leave? Did he leave you along the way? Why? Lily's eyes flickered. She clearly did not expect such a dry answer. He couldn't just leave. What happened in the forest? Nothing, Ethan snapped, taking the small bag from Spark's back. You don't need to know that. Dan left. That's it. She opened her mouth to protest, but his gaze silenced her. Something in Ethan's appearance said that he did not intend to continue the conversation. Lily saw him turn pale and haggard, with a gloomy determination in his eyes, as if he had gone through something he didn't want to talk about with anyone. But, she finally said, confused and quiet. He didn't say where. Ethan twitched the corner of his lips, taking half a step towards her. Lily tensed for a moment, as if expecting an explosion of rage. But he just ran his hand through his hair, slumping his shoulders tiredly. Don't know, and I don't want to know. She noticed that Ethan was covered in dirt and appeared to be limping. It seemed his own appearance left much to be desired. Maybe there was a fight, flashed through Lily's head. She recoiled, suddenly feeling a twinge of fear. Did he really find out something? What if he really? But she dared to ask quietly. Did you? Did you quarrel? There was only silence in response. Ethan turned and walked past her into the house. Lily followed him, but did not have time to catch up. He was already climbing the stairs to his room. He didn't say a word for the rest of the evening. Lily tried to approach him several times, but the door to the bedroom was closed. There were no sounds or footsteps coming from behind her. But the wind outside the windows grew stronger, and the house became uncomfortable. Lily rushed around the rooms, wrote messages to Dan, but received no answer. His phone was unreachable. Concern was mixed with guilt. She suspected that Ethan might have found out something, but she couldn't imagine why he didn't demand an explanation. Ethan, she shouted once, knocking on the door. Open it, let's talk. But in response, there was deathly silence. She could only retreat and painfully wait for the morning. Night has fallen. The squally wind and light rain knocked on the glass, and it seemed that the entire ranch was permeated with anxiety. Lily, unable to find a place for herself, wandered around the house and sat on the sofa, trying to calm down. She tried to call Dan, but the dial tone drowned in emptiness. The cell phone was running low, and a strange trembling did not go away until midnight. At some point, tired of her experiences, Lily lay down right on the sofa in the living room and dozed off, falling into an anxious half-sleep. She dreamed of fragments of some scenes, a forest, screams, shots. She woke up in the morning when the first dim glare cut through the windows. My head ached and my soul felt heavy. The first thing Lily remembered was Dan, and her heart sank painfully. Where could he have gone? Why is Ethan silent? She stood up, rubbed her eyes, and saw on the table note and wedding ring lying nearby. The note was short. Lily grabbed it with trembling fingers. Lily, I'm leaving. Don't wait for me. Goodbye. Ethan. One phrase, without further explanation. But the ring spoke volumes. He left their marriage here, along with this piece of paper. A lump rose in Lily's throat when she realized that her husband was not in the house. Knocking into the bedroom, she saw an empty room, a carefully made bed, which Ethan had neatly made before leaving. His things were missing from the closet, and his usual army backpack was missing in the corridor. No, no, Lily whispered, her eyes catching on any details, but everything pointed to the fact that Ethan had disappeared from her life. Freezing with horror, she ran into the garage. The door was open. Ethan's car was missing. A strong gust of wind almost knocked her off her feet. He really left, flashed through my mind. Standing in the middle of the empty garage, Lily felt a dull pain squeezing her heart. The husband found out the truth, or at least suspected the worst. She had nothing left but a short note, a wedding ring on the table, and oppressive loneliness. Above, heavy clouds continued to move in, promising a new downpour. Lily didn't know what to do. She took the ring in her hands and squeezed it in her palm. A quiet groan escaped her lips, something like "no" or "why," but there was no one to answer. The house, which had looked cozy just yesterday, now seemed terribly empty, as if the soul had been taken out of it. She walked back into the living room, clutching the ring to her chest, and quietly sank to the floor, wrapping her arms around her knees. Tears flowed by themselves, and it was as if consciousness had turned off. The world had collapsed. No husband, no lover, no clue as to what would happen next. Just a short note. I'm leaving. Don't wait for me. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even click to the next one.